When Ethan Mercer raised his hand to bid on an abandoned cabin for $500, the entire room went silent. Not the silence of competition, the silence of a funeral. No one countered. No one congratulated him. The rancher in the front row slowly shook his head the way a father might look at a son about to do something that cannot be undone. But the most terrifying thing was not their faces. It was what happened 2 weeks later. Trapped alone in a blizzard that sealed every road for 50 miles, Shadow, his retired military service dog, a dog who had never flinched at gunfire, at explosions, at anything, in 9 years of war, began clawing at the stone floor of the fireplace and howling in a way Ethan had only heard twice in his entire life. Both times were on a battlefield. Both times someone died. But to understand what Shadow found beneath that fireplace and why it had been hidden for 15 years, you first need to understand the man who bought the cabin, the town that feared it, and the journalist who vanished without a trace on a cold November night in 2009. This is a story about loyalty, the kind that does not come with words. It is about a soldier who traveled to Montana looking for peace and stumbled into something far more dangerous. It is about a dog who refused to stop warning his owner, even when every human being around them had chosen silence. And it is about a secret buried beneath stone and ash that powerful men were willing to kill to protect. What was hidden beneath that fireplace? Why had no one in the entire town dared to bid on the property? And what happened to Daniel Whitfield, the investigative journalist who disappeared from this very cabin 15 years ago, leaving behind his truck, his coat and a book still lying open on the table, as if he had simply stepped out for a moment and never came back? The answers will take us through a blizzard, a conspiracy, and the longest night of Ethan Mercer's life. The air inside the Flathead County Courthouse Annex smelled like every government building Ethan Mercer had ever been forced to sit in. Old paper, damp wool, coffee that had been sitting on a burner long enough to lose any right to be called coffee. It was the smell of bureaucracy, and it was a smell Ethan had spent 22 years in the United States Army learning to endure without complaint. He sat on a hard wooden bench near the back of the room, his posture straight as a flagpole. Not by choice, but by decades of muscle memory that no amount of civilian life could undo. His hands rested on his knees, still and steady, the hands of a man who had learned to wait in places far worse than this. His gaze drifted past the auctioneer at the front of the room, past the heads of the other attendees, and settled on the rain-streaked window, where the gray Montana sky pressed down on the world like a weight that would never lift. At his feet, lying with a quiet dignity that drew glances from nearly everyone in the room, was Shadow. Shadow was a German shepherd, but not the kind most people pictured when they heard the breed. His coat was not the standard black and tan. Instead, it was a striking and rare blend of silver gray and pale cream, a wolf-like sable pattern that had grown softer and lighter with each passing year. At 9 years old, Shadow was retired from a life of service that Ethan almost never spoke about. His muzzle was frosted white, and his intelligent eyes held a deep, knowing calm that made strangers stop and stare. He was more than a pet. He was more than a companion. He was an anchor, the one steady thing in a world that Ethan often found too loud, too fast, and too careless. Ethan himself was a man carved from quiet resilience. He was in his late 40s, tall and lean, with a wiry strength that came not from a gym, but from a lifetime of carrying heavy things over long distances. Packs, rifles, wounded friends. His brown hair, cut short and practical, was threaded with silver at the temples. His face told a story without a single word. Lines of concentration etched around kind blue eyes and a faint scar that cut across his left eyebrow. A memento from a firefight in Helmand province that he carried the way other men carried old photographs, as a proof of something survived. He had enlisted in the Army in 1999, 3 days after his 18th birthday. By September 11, 2001, he was already trained and ready. He deployed to Afghanistan in the first wave, a young infantryman who did not yet understand what war would cost him. Over the next 2 decades, he served in places whose names most Americans would struggle to pronounce: Kandahar, Kunar, Helmand, Mosul, Fallujah, Kunduz. He rose through the ranks not because he sought promotion, but because the men around him kept getting killed or going home broken and someone had to lead. Shadow had been with him for the last 6 years of his service. The dog had been trained as a multi-purpose military working dog. Explosives detection tracking patrol. He was assigned to Ethan's unit in 2016 during a particularly brutal deployment to northern Iraq. The bond between them was forged in the way that only shared danger can forge a bond. Instant, absolute, and permanent. In Kandahar province in the autumn of 2012, Ethan's unit had been clearing abandoned compounds suspected of hiding weapons caches. Shadow alerted on a building that appeared completely empty. Bare walls, dirt floor, nothing visible to the human eye. The patrol leader wanted to move on. Shadow refused. He planted his feet, pawed at the dirt, and barked with a frantic urgency that Ethan had never seen before. They dug. 2 feet beneath the surface, they found enough weapons and explosives to arm 50 men. That cache would have been used to attack an American forward operating base within the week. The second time was outside Mosul in 2016, a routine patrol through a neighborhood cleared of ISIS fighters. Shadow stopped at a garden wall, a low and unremarkable structure of cinder blocks, and sat down. He stared at the wall, trembling, refusing to move. When the explosive ordnance disposal team investigated, they found a command-detonated IED embedded inside the wall, itself connected to a trigger wire that led to a building across the street where a man was waiting with a cell phone. Shadow saved 11 lives that day. When Ethan finally left the Army in 2022, after 22 years of service, he took Shadow with him. The dog was officially retired, his service record classified as war behind him. They drifted through 3 states in 2 years: Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, each time moving farther from civilization, each time seeking a quieter place. What Ethan needed, money could not buy. He needed a place where the noise stopped. A place where the ghosts of the men he could not save would stop visiting him in the small hours of the night. He thought he had found it in Flathead County. 3 weeks before the auction, Ethan had been at the county clerk's office researching available land. He was not looking for anything grand, just a few acres with trees, water, and no neighbors. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain, had been helpful until Ethan pointed to a particular parcel on the county map. Parcel 7B, he said, the one marked in red. What is that? The woman's face changed. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the mouth, a flicker in the eyes. But Ethan had spent 2 decades reading faces under stress, and he recognized the look immediately. It was fear. That is the old Whitfield place, she said, pulling her hand away from the map as if the paper itself were hot. It has been in tax delinquency for 15 years. It is going to public auction next month, but nobody is going to bid on it. She would not say more. She excused herself suddenly, finding urgent filing that needed attention in the back room. But the seed had been planted. The county records told a dry, factual story. The property, 160 acres of heavily forested land with a single cabin, 1 well, and no road access beyond a dirt trail, had belonged to a man named Daniel Whitfield. Whitfield had purchased the land in 2008, paying full market price with cash. He was listed as a freelance journalist, formerly employed by the Richmond Times-Dispatch in Virginia. He had no family in the area, no known business connections, no apparent reason to be in rural Montana, except a desire for solitude. In December 2009, Whitfield was reported missing. His truck was found at the cabin, keys in the ignition. His coat was still hanging on a hook by the door. The only thing missing was Daniel Whitfield himself. The sheriff's department conducted a search, or at least filed paperwork claiming they had. No body was found. No evidence of foul play was documented. The case was classified as a voluntary disappearance. The property taxes went unpaid. Year after year, the bills accumulated. And for 15 years, through a series of administrative delays that seemed less like bureaucratic inefficiency and more like deliberate obstruction, the property sat in limbo, untouched, unclaimed, forgotten. Someone had been keeping it that way. The question was why. Now back in the courthouse annex, the auctioneer adjusted his glasses. Next up, Parcel 7B, known locally as the old Whitfield place. The shift in the room was not a sound but a sensation, a collective intake of breath, a sudden stillness that pressed against Ethan's skin like a change in atmospheric pressure. The low hum of whispered conversations ceased as if someone had pulled the plug on a radio. Property consists of 160 acres. Single cabin condition listed as poor. One well status unknown. Sold as is where is. 15 years of unpaid property taxes. 15 years. The number hung in the stale air like smoke. We will open the bidding and at $500. Ethan raised his hand. 500. I have 500 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear sick silence? Not the pause between bids. The silence of a community holding a shared secret, watching an outsider stumble toward a danger they all understood but none would name. Shadow lifted his head, his ears twitching as he registered the change in the room's emotional temperature. Ethan placed his hand on the dog's broad skull, drawing comfort from the familiar warmth. He looked around the room. A farmer in worn overalls stared back with naked pity. A woman in a wool shawl pressed her hand to her mouth. No one looked envious. No one looked angry. They looked at him the way people look at a man walking willingly toward the edge of a cliff. Going once. Going twice. The rancher in the front row, a man in his 60s with a face carved by decades of wind and sun, caught Ethan's eye. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head, a final, silent warning. Ethan held his gaze and did not look away. Sold. To the gentleman in the back for $500. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the room like a rifle shot. As Ethan walked to the front to sign the papers and hand over 5 crisp $100 bills, the dam of silence broke. Whispers followed him like shadows. Does not know what he just bought. The Whitfield place. Cursed, I tell you. The clerk who processed his payment refused to meet his gaze. She pushed the deed across the counter as though it were contaminated. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean. Ethan folded the deed into his pocket and walked toward Main Street with Shadow at his side. The sign above the general store read Prescott's in faded letters. A bell chimed as he entered. The store smelled of sawdust leather and freshly ground coffee. Behind the counter stood the oldest man Ethan had seen in a long time. His face was a landscape of wrinkles and sunspots. A name was stitched on his apron. Tom Prescott. Afternoon. What can I get for you? Just a few things. A padlock, some lamp oil, coffee, and a new axe handle if you carry them. As Tom gathered the items, he studied Ethan with undisguised curiosity. You are the fellow who just bought the Whitfield place. News travels fast. In a town this size, news does not travel. It just sort of appears like weather. Tom set the padlock on the counter and leaned forward, his friendly expression turning grave. That land belonged to a journalist named Daniel Whitfield, sharp fellow from Virginia. He told people he was retired writing a book about nature. Nobody believed him. He was investigating Ridgeline Mining Corporation, the biggest employer in 3 counties. The company that built the new gym at the high school donated the ambulance-sponsored Little League. The company everybody loved, or at least everybody pretended to love. Then one day in November 2009, Whitfield just vanished. Truck at the cabin, coat on the hook, coffee mug on the table. Gone. Sheriff Braddock ran a search, found nothing. Case closed. Tom wiped the counter with a clean cloth, though it was already spotless. I will tell you something I have not told anyone in a long time. My daughter Sarah was a teacher at the elementary school. In 2010, 3 children in her class were diagnosed with leukemia. 3 children in one classroom, in a town of fewer than 2,000 people. Sarah started asking questions about the water, about the wells downstream from Ridgeline's operations, about the strange taste some folks noticed in their tap water after heavy rains. She was transferred to a school in Missoula within a month. They called it a promotion. She knew what it really was. Tom met Ethan's eyes directly. Everyone knows. Everyone in this town knows something is wrong with the water. But Ridgeline pays the bills. Ridgeline built the roads. Ridgeline owns the sheriff and half the county board. So people drink bottled water and keep their mouths shut. They have been keeping their mouths shut for 15 years. The old man paused. They are not afraid of ghosts, son. They are afraid of the living. Ethan paid for his supplies and turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. Tom, the three children. What happened to them? The old man's face seemed to age 10 years in a single heartbeat. Two survived. Jenny McAllister is 21 now, studying nursing in Bozeman. Tyler Vance coaches basketball at the middle school. Bald from the chemo, but tough as they come. And the third, Katie Burke. She was 7 years old. She died in March of 2011. They buried her behind the Methodist church. Her mother still puts fresh flowers on the grave every Sunday. The bell chimed as Ethan walked out. Shadow pressed against his leg, sensing the shift in his mood, the tightening of the jaw, the slight acceleration of the heartbeat. The dog did not know the words, but he understood the emotion. Something was very wrong, and his person was walking toward it, not away from it. The drive to the property was a steady unwinding of civilization. Paved road to gravel, gravel to dirt. Dirt to two ruts carved into the earth by vehicles that had long since stopped coming. 100 yards past the gate, a massive pine log lay across the trail, forcing a sharp detour. Further along, thorny bushes crowded one side of the path, pushing the truck dangerously close to a deep ditch. Then Ethan saw something that erased any remaining doubt. Between two large pines at chest height, a thin steel wire had been strung across the path, nearly invisible, harmless to a truck but potentially lethal to a person on foot or on a motorcycle. Ethan stopped the truck, cut the wire with his multi-tool, and coiled it into his pocket. Someone had been engineering this trail to discourage visitors for a very long time. These were not random obstacles. They were deterrents placed with the same deliberate logic as the roadblocks and checkpoints Ethan had encountered in combat zones. The cabin appeared at the end of the trail, emerging from the tree line like a soldier stepping out of cover. Small, dark logs, crumbling mortar, a sagging porch, windows like blind eyes coated in grime, the stone chimney rising from the roof covered in moss and lichen. It looked weary, a forgotten thing slowly surrendering to the forest. The front door was unlocked. It swung open on protesting hinges into a single large room shrouded in dust and shadow. A wooden table and two chairs in the center, a bare iron bed frame against the far wall, and dominating the left side of the room, the fireplace. A massive construction of river stones reaching from floor to ceiling. On the table sat a ceramic coffee mug with a faded blue ring. Beside it, a book lay face down, its pages yellowed and curled. On a peg near the door, a heavy wool coat still hung. One of its pockets bulged. Ethan reached into the pocket and withdrew two items. A small USB, drive its connector green with oxidation, and a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was hurried and pressed deep into the paper with the urgency of a man who knew he was running out of time. If you are reading this, I did not make it. Look beneath the place where the fire never reaches. Ethan read the words twice. Then he looked at the fireplace. Then he looked at Shadow. The dog stood frozen in the center of the room. Every muscle rigid, eyes locked on the stone hearth, a low and trembling whine vibrating in his chest. His ears were flat against his skull, and the fur along his spine bristled. This was not anxiety. This was detection. Shadow was performing the same alert Ethan had seen in Kandahar and Mosul. The same intensity, the same absolute conviction that something was hidden, something was wrong, and his human needed to know about it. On the wall behind the door, hidden beneath years of dust, hung a board covered with a map. Ethan wiped it clean. Beneath the grime was a topographical map of the county with dozens of red pins connected by thin red threads, forming a web that radiated outward from a single point labeled in black marker. Ridge Line Mining Primary Operations. And in the corner, in the same desperate handwriting as the note, 3 words: the water flows down. Ethan stood in the fading light surrounded by the artifacts of a dead man's investigation and felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He had come to Montana looking for silence. Instead, he had found a voice that had been waiting 15 years to be heard. That night, he slept in the truck while Shadow dozed in the passenger seat. The cabin needed airing out before it was habitable, and Ethan needed time to think. He lay awake in his sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the while assembling the pieces. The auction, where the townspeople treated the deed like a death warrant. Tom Prescott's stories, the obstacles on the trail, the note in the coat pocket, the map with its red pins, and Shadow's unwavering focus on the fireplace hearth. It was too deliberate, too coordinated, too sustained over too many years to be coincidence or superstition. This place was not haunted by a ghost. It was guarded by a story. The rumors of a curse, the isolation, the bureaucratic delays that kept the property in limbo for 15 years. It was all a wall, a carefully maintained fiction designed to keep people away from whatever Daniel Whitfield had left behind. Tomorrow he would find out what it was. He woke to a sky the color of a bruise. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper through the pines the evening before, now howled with a mournful predatory voice that rattled the truck and sent pine needles streaming horizontally through the air. The first snowflakes were already falling. Not the picturesque flakes of Christmas cards, but thick, heavy, wet flakes that fell with the weight of something deliberate. This was a blizzard's advance guard arriving early in the season with brutal force. Shadow was already awake and alert, his ears pricked forward as he listened to the rising fury. Staying in the truck was no longer an option. The cabin offered solid walls against the coming storm. They spent the next hour moving everything essential inside: sleeping bag, crate of canned food and military rations, water container, tools, supplies from the general store. Each trip was a battle against the strengthening wind. By the time they finished, the snow was falling in a blinding curtain that reduced the world to a swirling white tunnel. Ethan built the fire carefully. He checked the flue, reaching up into the chimney with a gloved hand. Clear. The stone structure was sound despite its age. He laid kindling, struck a match, and coaxed a flame into existence. It caught and spread and began to push its warmth into the room. The firelight transformed the cabin. Shadows danced on the log walls. The room that had felt dead the day before now flickered with something that resembled life. But the warmth brought Shadow no comfort. As the fire grew, the dog's agitation escalated. He refused the blanket Ethan laid out. He began to pace in front of the hearth, a tight, relentless circuit, his claws clicking on the wooden floorboards. Then he lowered his head and began to paw at one specific stone at the base of the hearth. Not randomly, with the focused, methodical intensity of a trained detection dog performing an alert. He looked back at Ethan and barked. Once. Sharp. Demanding. Trust your partner. It was the first and most sacred rule of working with a military dog. Your partner sees what you cannot see. Your partner smells what you cannot smell. When your partner alerts you, listen. Ethan stood up. He lit the lantern and set it on the table. All right, boy, show me. What did you find? Shadow stopped barking instantly. He sniffed at the specific stone, a large rectangular slab of slate, the surface notably smoother than the rounded river stones surrounding it. Ethan knelt beside his dog and ran his gloved fingers along the edges. The mortar around this particular stone was different. It was not the same crumbling sandy mixture that held the rest of the fireplace together. This material was darker, slightly flexible, and in several places it had been covered with a thin layer of ash and dirt carefully disguised to match the surrounding stonework. It was not mortar, it was sealant, pitch, hardened over years but distinctly different from structural cement. This stone had not been built into the fireplace. It had been placed, designed to look permanent but engineered to be removable. A door disguised as a floor. Ethan retrieved his utility knife and scraped along the edge. The blade sank in. He dug deeper, carving a thin channel around the perimeter, exposing the dark rubbery seam of hardened pitch. He grabbed the crowbar. The steel was cold and heavy in his hands. He wedged the flat end into the seam and put his full weight into the lever. For a long moment, nothing happened. The stone resisted. 15 years of compression and settling had locked it in place. He repositioned, found better leverage, braced his boots against the floor, and pushed with everything his body could generate. His shoulders burned. His arms shook. Then the seal cracked. He worked the crowbar around the perimeter, chipping away at the hardened pitch inch by inch. Each crack echoed through the cabin. Finally, with a long, scraping screech that sent a shiver through Shadow's entire body, one side of the slate lifted. He dropped the crowbar, gripped the exposed edge with both hands, and pulled. The slab was enormously heavy, but it moved. It slid free and landed on the floorboards with a thud that shook dust from the ceiling beams. Shadow fell completely silent. His pacing stopped. He stood beside Ethan and looked down into the dark rectangular opening with an expression of calm, satisfied attention. His tail moved in a slow, steady wag. Ethan held the lantern over the hole. Below was not earth. It was a man-made cavity roughly 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, lined on all sides with carefully fitted stones. A cellar within a cellar. A hiding place constructed with the same craftsmanship as the fireplace itself. At the bottom, resting on the dry stone floor, were 3 objects. The first was a heavy, dark green metal ammunition box, sealed and showing no sign of rust. The second was a neat stack of 5 leather-bound notebooks tied together with faded twine. The third was a portable cassette recorder, a silver and black Sony wrapped in a sealed plastic bag that had kept it perfectly preserved for 15 years. Ethan lowered himself into the cellar and lifted the objects out one by one, placing them on the table beside Daniel Whitfield's coffee mug and unfinished book. Then he climbed out, poured himself a cup of black coffee from the percolator on the edge of the hearth, and sat down. The storm howled outside. The fire crackled. Shadow lay down at his feet and rested his chin on his paws. Ethan opened the first notebook. The handwriting was neat and dense, the script of a disciplined mind. The first entry was dated January 2008. The early pages were observations of the natural world, the way frost transformed the meadows into fields of crystal, the sound of elk in the autumn valleys, the silence of the Montana wilderness at night. Whitfield wrote like a man who had found something he had been searching for his entire life. By March 2008, the tone began to change. Spoke with 2 ranchers at the feed store today. Both mentioned that their cattle refused to drink from Grizzly Creek anymore. The animals walk past it to the stock tank, even when the creek is closer. Animals know. They always know before we do. By June, the observations had become an investigation. Lab results are back from the independent facility in Bozeman. Arsenic levels at sampling points 2, 3, and 4 are between 40 and 200 times the EPA maximum contaminant level. Lead concentrations downstream of the mining operation exceed safe limits by a factor of 75. And there are traces of industrial solvents that have no business being anywhere near a freshwater creek in rural Montana. This is not accidental. This is systematic. Then the entries turned personal. August 2008, county inspector arrived unannounced, cited a complaint about my septic system. There is no complaint on file. I checked. Fine of $2,200. September 2008, another inspector. This time the chimney fails to meet code. The chimney has stood for 50 years. Fine of $1,800. October 2008, property line dispute. Official documents have appeared suggesting my eastern boundary is 40 feet closer to the cabin than my deed states. November 2008. They are trying to bleed me dry, to bury me in fines and legal paperwork until I give up and walk away. This is not random harassment. It is a coordinated campaign to force me off my own land so that whatever I have found can be buried again. But I will not break. Then Ethan found the entry about the dog. November 2nd, 2009. Found Copper by the creek this morning. He was lying on his side in the tall grass near the water. I thought he was sleeping. He was not sleeping. His muzzle was covered in foam. I carried him back to the cabin and drove to the veterinary clinic in Kalispell. The blood work came back this afternoon. Strychnine. They poisoned my dog. Ethan stopped reading. He looked down at Shadow sleeping lightly at his feet. He placed his hand on the dog's side and felt the heartbeat beneath the warm fur. Steady, strong, present. He turned back to the notebook. Whitfield's handwriting had changed after Copper's death. The letters were pressed harder, the lines less even. The careful tone gave way to something raw. They took my dog. They killed a good and innocent creature to send me a message, and the message has been received. But it is not the message they intended. I will not run. I will finish what I started, and I will make sure the evidence survives even if I do not. Ethan set down the notebook and reached for the cassette recorder. He unwrapped a plastic bag, carefully replaced the dead batteries with spares from his emergency kit, and pressed play. Static, a faint hiss. Then a voice filled the cabin for the first time in 15 years. Recording November 14th, 2009. This is Daniel Whitfield. The voice was younger than Ethan had expected, tense but controlled. The voice of a man who was afraid but had decided that fear was not a sufficient reason to stop. I met with my source inside Ridgeline today. I will refer to him as Pike to protect his identity. Pike confirmed what I have suspected for months. Ridgeline mining is not merely dumping waste illegally. They are operating a subsurface ejection system, a network of underground pipes and pumps that channels untreated mine tailings water directly into the regional aquifer. The permitted tailings, upon the one that appears in all of Ridgeline's environmental filings, is essentially a prop. Pike says it is nearly empty because the real waste is being injected underground through a system of wells disguised as exploratory drill holes. The contamination has been spreading through the aquifer for at least 4 years. Then the voice dropped lower. Pike provided documentation, engineering diagrams, internal memos, financial records, and a name. The injection system was not authorized by Ridgeline's board. It was approved directly and personally by the company's primary investor and political patron, Senator Richard Ainsworth. Senator Ainsworth personally approved the injection system during a private meeting in 2005 because it would save Ridgeline $12 million per year in compliance costs. $12 million. That is the price of a valley's health. That is the price of children's lives. The tape shifted to a different recording. A conversation between Whitfield and a second voice, distorted by fear, speaking rapidly. Pike. He described the injection system in technical detail. The depth of the wells, the volume of waste, the pressure of the pumps. His voice trembled, but his information was precise. The final recording on the tape was dated November 28th, 2009, 3 days before Whitfield was officially reported missing. This may be my last recording. Pike contacted me 2 days ago to say he would leave Montana by the end of the week. He said they were watching him. I have not heard from him since. I believe Pike has either fled or been dealt with. A long pause. The wind from 15 years ago moaned through the cabin logs on the tape. I know they will come for me. I have hidden everything in the cellar beneath the hearth. The fireplace is stone. Even if they burn the cabin, the evidence will survive. His voice softened. I am alone and I am afraid and I wish I were not. My dog Copper. They poisoned him. He was a good dog. He deserved better. Another pause. Whoever finds this, please, be braver than I was. Do not do this alone. And do not trust the local sheriff. The tape clicked and fell silent. Ethan sat motionless for a long time. The fire had burned low. Shadow slept at his feet. A journalist who came to Montana to uncover the truth. A dog who was poisoned for being loyal. A source who vanished. A senator who signed off on the poisoning of a valley. And all of it buried beneath a stone floor for 15 years waiting for someone to listen. He was still processing the weight of this discovery when Shadow's head snapped up from the floor. The dog's body went rigid. A growl low and sustained began to build in his chest. His eyes locked on the cabin door. Someone was coming. The sound reached Ethan a moment later. The grinding whine of an engine fighting through deep snow. No one should be driving in this storm. No one traveled to the end of a forgotten trail in the middle of a blizzard for a social call. Ethan moved fast. He gathered the notebooks, the metal box, and the recorder and lowered them back into the cellar. He slid the slate slab into position, leaving just enough of a gap to retrieve it later, and kicked dirt and ash over the seam until it looked undisturbed. He straightened, controlled his breathing, and placed one hand on Shadow's head. The engine stopped outside. A heavy fist pounded on the door. Ethan opened it 6 inches. Sheriff Lyle Braddock stood on the porch filling the frame. Broad-shouldered, thick-set, his winter coat bore the insignia of the Flathead County Sheriff's Department. His face was ruddy from the cold, his thick mustache frosted with ice. But it was his eyes that told the truth, small and dark and flat, devoid of warmth. They swept the interior of the cabin over Ethan's shoulder with the practiced efficiency of a man taking inventory. Afternoon, quite a storm. I was in the area and heard the deed finally went through. Figured I would check on the new owner. In the area, Ethan said evenly, "This is a long way from any area sheriff." Braddock shrugged and stepped inside waiting for an invitation. He brought a blast of cold air and the faint smell of cigar smoke. His eyes never stopped moving. The fire, the sleeping bag, the supplies on the table, the hearth. Shadow stood motionless, a gray statue of absolute distrust. His head was low. His eyes did not leave the sheriff. "That is quite a dog," Braddock commented, giving Shadow a wide berth. "He is a good judge of character." Braddock's jaw tightened beneath his mustache. He produced a manila folder from inside his coat and set it on the table. "There is a complication with your purchase. An outstanding mineral rights claim from 2007. Ridgeline Mining asserts subsurface extraction rights under an agreement that predates your deed. You may need to sort this out in court." Ethan looked at the folder but did not touch it. He recognized the tactic from Whitfield's journals. The same playbook. Fines, inspections, property disputes. Paperwork designed to make the target feel overwhelmed and powerless. "I will have my lawyer look at it." Braddock blinked. He had expected confusion, concern, the first tremor of intimidation. Instead, he got nothing, just friendly advice. "This land has a history. People who dig around in it tend to find more trouble than they bargain for." "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. Thank you for driving all the way out here in a blizzard to deliver it." Braddock left without another word. Ethan bolted the door and watched through the window as the tail lights vanished into the white chaos. Then he pulled on his coat and went outside. The wind tore at him, snow drove into his face. He fought his way to the truck and began checking the tires. The driver's side rear tire had a deep, clean puncture in the sidewall. Not a rock, not a nail, a deliberate stab with a thin, sharp blade placed at the precise angle to cause a slow, irreversible leak. The sheriff's visit had not been a conversation. It had been an operation. The paperwork was the distraction. The punctured tire was the objective. They wanted him trapped. But the tire was not all he found. Beneath the truck, attached to the frame near the front axle with a small, powerful magnet, was a black plastic box the size of a deck of cards, a GPS tracking device. They did not just want him immobilized. They wanted to know exactly where he was at all times. Ethan held the device in his palm. Then he looked across the clearing to where a young mule deer doe stood at the edge of the tree line watching him through the fallen snow. He walked toward her slowly. She held her ground, her dark eyes wide. With gentle, patient movements, he fastened the GPS device to a small loop of cord and placed it loosely around the deer's neck. She flinched but did not bolt. "Go on, sweetheart. Give them a good chase." The deer turned and bounded into the forest carrying the tracking signal north away from the cabin, deep into the backcountry wilderness. Back inside, Shadow was waiting, tail wagging once. But Ethan knew the GPS trick would only buy hours, not days. Hargrave did not need the tracker to find him. The cabin was the only place Ethan could be, and the punctured tire ensured he could not leave. They would come regardless of where the GPS signal pointed. The tracker had been insurance, not navigation, which meant the clock was already running. The blizzard exhausted itself overnight. Ethan woke on the second morning to a silence so complete it felt like the earth was holding its breath. The landscape was buried under 3 feet of pristine white. The sun was brilliant against the snow. He spent the morning digging out his truck and patching the slashed tire. Shadow took up a post on the porch, his gray and silver coat blending with the snow-dusted railing, scanning the tree line with quiet vigilance. It was just past noon when a new sound broke the silence. Not the struggling whine of an old SUV, a deep, powerful engine roar that spoke of money and engineering. A massive, brand-new pickup truck, black as obsidian. Its chrome gleaming parted the deep snow with arrogant ease and pulled us to a stop beside Ethan's mud-splattered vehicle. The man who stepped out was tall, perhaps 6'2", and carried himself with the unconscious confidence of someone for whom the world had always cooperated. He was in his late 50s, his thick hair a distinguished silver, his beard neatly trimmed. He wore an expensive winter jacket and boots that had never touched mud. His hands, when he removed his leather gloves, were soft and uncalloused. The hands of a man who commanded others to do the digging, the building, the burying. Warren Hargrave, chairman and founder of Ridgeline Mining Corporation, the most powerful man in 3 counties. "Mr. Mercer, I am Warren Hargrave. I apologize for dropping in unannounced, but the storm had us all pinned down. I wanted to come by personally and introduce myself." Shadow let out a low guttural growl from the porch steps. "You have introduced yourself," Ethan said, not moving from his position by the truck. "Is there something I can do for you?" Hargrave's smile remained, but his eyes, the color of cold steel, were calculating rapidly behind the pleasant mask. "I like directness, so I will be direct. I want to buy this property. My company has been acquiring parcels in this valley for a development project, and this land is essential. I am prepared to offer you $100,000. Cash. Today. $100,000. 200 times what Ethan had paid. The offer was not generous. It was desperate. "It is not for sale." Hargrave did not immediately press. Instead, he walked to the porch without invitation, sat down on the top step, and poured coffee from a thermos he had brought from his truck. "Let me tell you something about myself, Mercer. I grew up 30 miles from here. My father was a miner, not a mining executive, a miner, underground in the dark, breathing dust. His hands were cracked year-round. He died of black lung disease at 54. I was 16 years old. I built Ridgeline because I swore I would never die the way my father died. I would own the mine, not work in it." He paused, letting the story settle. "But to build something like Ridgeline, you have to make decisions that ordinary people cannot understand. Hard decisions, necessary decisions." Then Hargrave said the name. Daniel Whitfield was a talented journalist, but he did not understand that sometimes the truth needs to be managed for the greater good. It was the first time anyone had spoken Whitfield's name to Ethan without fear. 200,000, Hargrave said. "Final offer, no." Hargrave's smile cracked. "You know," Ethan said quietly, "I have been reading a lot since I got here. About Ridgeline, about the water, about the children." Silence. 3 kids in one classroom. One of them did not make it. Katie Burke, 7 years old. "Do you know about her, mister?" Hargrave. The silence stretched. Snow dripped from the eaves. Shadow growled. Hargrave stood up slowly. The mask was gone. What remained was the face of a man who wielded power without conscience. You have just made the biggest mistake of your life. The last man who stood where you are standing disappeared. No one found him. No one looked very hard. He climbed into his truck, slammed the door, and drove away, leaving deep, angry ruts in the pristine snow. 2 miles down the trail, Hargrave pulled over and picked up a satellite phone. He knows. I do not know how much, but he knows enough. He mentioned the children. He mentioned Katie Burke by name. No, he refused the money. Both offers. He is not a man who can be bought. I warned you about the auction. 15 years of keeping that place sealed and it all falls apart because nobody caught a tax delinquency notice. I will handle it. But this has to happen tonight. The storm. Another one is coming. It will provide cover. By morning, the cabin and everything in it needs to be gone. The man and the dog, too. Back at the cabin, Ethan was already planning. He had known since the moment Hargrave drove away that the timeline had accelerated. The mention of Whitfield's disappearance was not a threat. It was a preview. They had killed once. They would kill again. And the approaching storm would give them cover. He needed to get the evidence out. He needed a contingency plan for when he could not get out himself. He needed Connor Walsh. They had served together in the 3rd Ranger Battalion, 2 young men navigating the chaos of Afghanistan in the years after September 11th. Connor had been the kind of soldier who questioned everything not out of insubordination, but out of a genuine belief that there was always a better way. After the Army, he channeled that questioning nature into investigative journalism. He was now based in Denver, known for his tenacity and his absolute refusal to be intimidated. Ethan left the cabin at 3:15 in the morning, hours before the first gray light would touch the mountains. The storm had weakened enough to drive, but not enough to make driving easy. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, alert and watchful. He had not hesitated when Ethan opened the truck door. Where Ethan went, Shadow went. It was not loyalty in the way most people understood the word. It was identity. He drove east for an hour in the wrong direction, a counter-surveillance route. He turned onto a logging road, drove 3 miles, and stopped. Killed the engine. Watched the road behind him in the mirrors. Nothing. He doubled back, took random turns, checked for any pattern of headlights in the darkness. Nothing. The world was empty. In Kalispell, Ethan was a ghost. He parked 3 blocks from downtown, bought a prepaid phone from an electronics store with cash, walked to the public library and found a computer terminal in a back corner. He scanned the most critical documents. The lab reports, the topographical map, 3 pages from Whitfield's journal, a transcription of the key tape sections. He encrypted the files using a cipher he and Connor had established years ago, based on the name of a mountain in Afghanistan, where they had once been pinned down for 3 days. Takur Ghar, the site of a battle in March 2002 that neither of them spoke about, but neither would forget. He sent the encrypted files to Connor's secure email. Logged out, cleared the browser history. In a cold alley between 2 brick buildings, he activated the burner phone and dialed Connor's number from memory. 2 rings. Walsh. Connor, it is Ethan. Ethan Mercer. That is a voice I have not heard in a while, and this is not your number. It is temporary. I do not have much time. I have stumbled into something in Montana, a mining company called Ridgeline, a missing journalist named Whitfield, and a United States Senator named Ainsworth. I have sent preliminary evidence to your secure inbox. The password is the name of the mountain. Connor would know. He had been there. Got it. I see the file. Ethan, what kind of trouble are you in, the kind that sends professionals to your door at 3 in the morning? They killed the last man who found this evidence. They poisoned his dog. They slashed my tire and planted a tracker on my truck during a blizzard. There is more. On the tape, Whitfield mentions a source inside Ridgeline. Codename Pike. Real name Gerald Fenton. Chief engineer. Fenton disappeared the same week Whitfield did. If the FBI can find Fenton alive or dead, that is the key to the entire case. Here it is the plan. Another storm is hitting tonight. I am heading back to protect the original evidence. If you do not receive a call from me on this phone by 0600 tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. in Mountain Time, you assume the worst. You take everything I sent you and you give it to the FBI. Not the state police, not the local sheriff, federal agents. You give them the files and the GPS coordinates. Tell them to come heavy. 0600, Connor. Repeated, if I do not hear from you, I raise hell. One more thing. If they find me dead, make sure the story gets published. Whitfield did not die for nothing. Neither did his dog. Neither will you. Watch your sixth brother. Always. Ethan removed the battery from the phone and dropped the pieces into separate trash cans. The contingency was in place. The evidence was duplicated. The clock was running. They reached the cabin as the sky darkened. The second storm system was arriving exactly as forecast. Bigger, angrier, more violent than the first. By the time Ethan pulled the tarp over the truck and carried the last of his supplies inside, the world had dissolved into a horizontal wall of snow and wind. Inside the cabin, Ethan transformed. The retired veteran disappeared and the combat soldier emerged. He set tripwire alarms around the perimeter, connecting thin steel wire to tin cans filled with pebbles between the trees. He dug shallow depressions in the snow at the most likely approach paths and covered them with pine branches. He positioned a small mirror on the back porch, angled to catch any flashlight beam from the woods behind the cabin. Shadow worked beside him without instruction, moving through the deepening snow. With fluid purpose, his nose reading the wind, his ears rotating constantly. Inside, he barricaded the door with a heavy table, reinforced the windows with planks from the bed frame, checked his rifle. A bolt-action 30-06 clean and loaded, 14 rounds. He set out his supplies within reach. Flashlight, first aid kit, thermos of coffee, dried meat for himself and Shadow. Then he sat down in the chair with the best sight lines to both the door and the rear window. Shadow lay at his feet, not sleeping, listening. In a moment of stillness between gusts, Ethan looked down at his dog. Shadow's silver-gray coat caught the last glow of the firelight. His muzzle was white, his breathing was steady. 9 years old, slower than he used to be. But his eyes were as sharp and present as they had been on the day they met in that dusty compound in northern Iraq, when both of them had been damaged and both of them had found in each other something worth continuing for. You deserve better than this, old friend. A warm bed somewhere, a yard, somebody throwing tennis balls every afternoon. Not this. Shadow turned his head and licked Ethan's hand. Once. A gesture so simple that it carried the entire weight of their shared history. Every patrol, every firefight, every cold night in a foreign country, when the only comfort either of them had was the warmth of the other's body. Ethan closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, his face was set. All right, let us finish this. The perimeter alarms triggered at 12:47 a.m. The northern wire first. A faint rattle of pebbles and tin barely audible through the storm. Shadow's head snapped up. 30 seconds later, the western alarm. Then the eastern one. 3 directions. Simultaneous. Coordinated. This was not amateurs stumbling through the woods. This was a planned assault. The first probe came at 1:15. A rifle shot punched through the front window and buried itself in the far wall. Not aimed to kill, aimed to test. Ethan did not react. He sat motionless in the darkness. Shadow pressed against his leg, both of them invisible. The next 2 hours were psychological warfare. The attackers probed his defenses, methodically firing shots, sending shadows past windows, testing barricades. They wanted him exhausted and afraid. They did not account for Shadow. The dog was a biological sensor system operating beyond the limits of human perception. When Shadow turned his head left and growled softly, a threat was moving along the west wall. When his ears pricked toward the door, someone was approaching from the front. When Shadow went completely silent and pressed his body flat to the floor, the threat was close and the dog was preparing to act. They communicated without words, a language of breath and posture built from 9 years of shared danger. At 4:10, after nearly 3 hours of probing, silence fell. The wind still howled, but the human sound ceased. Ethan recognized the pattern, the lull before the final push. At 4:38, Shadow's behavior changed. He had been facing the front door. Now, without warning, he spun toward the rear of the cabin. Not a growl, a single sharp bark. The bark Ethan had heard exactly twice in 9 years, both times immediately before something tried to kill them at close range. A shape detached itself from the darkness at the rear window. Someone had silently removed the boards and was sliding through the opening. A dark figure landing on the cabin floor with less sound than a cat. A pistol glinted in his hand. Shadow launched himself across the floor. 90 pounds of muscle and training compressed into a single explosive movement. He went for the legs. His shoulder slammed into the back of the intruder's knees. The man pitched forward, arms flailing. Shadow struck again, clamping his powerful jaws onto the man's right forearm, the one holding the pistol. The scream that followed was primal. The man's fingers spasmed open. The pistol clattered to the floor. Shadow held his grip with the calm, immovable certainty of a trap that has closed and will not open until commanded. Ethan kicked the pistol away and dragged the man to the center of the room. Shadow release. The dog opened his jaws and positioned himself between the intruder and the breached window. The man was young, 30, maybe. Lean and wiry in dark, tactical clothing. He was cradling his mangled forearm. How many outside? 4 more. And him. Who is him? Hargrave. He is out there. He said if we could not get it done, he would burn the place. Something small and metallic lay on the floor near the door, dropped during the struggle. A silver Zippo lighter, its surface engraved with 2 initials. L.B. Lyle Braddock. The sheriff was not just directing from behind a desk. He was here, part of the assault team. Ethan pocketed the lighter. One more piece of evidence. Then Warren Hargrave's voice erupted from the darkness outside, distorted by the storm, but unmistakable. Enough. We are out of time. If we cannot get it, nobody gets it. Burn it. Burn it all. The front window exploded inward. A large container of liquid sailed through the opening. The pungent, oily stench of kerosene filled the cabin instantly. The liquid splashed across the wooden floor, the table legs, the scattered debris. A second container came through the rear window. Ethan had seconds. He lunged for the hearth, gripped the edge of the slate slab, and wrenched it aside. The cellar below was intact. Stone walls, stone floor, stone ceiling formed by the underside of the hearth. The green metal box, the notebooks, the cassette recorder, all dry, damaged, protected by the one structure in the cabin that fire could not consume. Whitfield had designed it this way. He had known they would try to burn it. He had built his hiding place inside the only fireproof part of the building. Ethan shoved the slab back into place. He cut the paracord binding the captured intruder to the bed frame and pointed to the rear window. Go. Now, the man threw himself through the opening and disappeared. Shadow. To me. The dog was already at his side, pressed against his leg, trembling not with fear but with readiness. Then the torch came. A branch wrapped in burning cloth sailing through the shattered window in a lazy arc. It landed in the pool of kerosene. The ignition was instantaneous. A whoosh of orange flame erupted from the floor. The century-old pine logs caught fire with terrifying speed. The far wall became a sheet of flame in seconds. The ceiling followed. The heat hit Ethan like a physical blow. Black smoke rolled across the ceiling and began to descend. Ethan dropped to his knees. Shadow was already low, staying beneath the worst of the smoke. Their eyes met through the orange hellscape. The door. Stay with me. They crawled toward the front of the cabin. The heat was beyond description. Ethan's shirt began to smolder. He could smell burning hair. He reached the door, rose to a crouch, and kicked with everything he had left. The door burst outward. Cold air rushed in. Behind them, the inrush of oxygen fed the fire into something beyond fire. A roaring inferno that blew out the remaining windows and sent a column of flame 30 feet into the sky. Ethan and Shadow tumbled through the doorway, across the porch, and into the snow. The cold hit them like a wall. Shocking, brutal, and in that moment, the most beautiful sensation Ethan had ever experienced. He rolled extinguishing embers on his clothing. Shadow shook himself violently, sending sparks flying from his singed coat. Then they both turned to face what was waiting. Warren Hargrave stood 20 feet from the burning cabin, silhouetted against the inferno. To his left, two men with rifles. To his right, a larger figure in a sheriff's department coat. Lyle Braddock, his mustache crusted with snow, his small, dark eyes reflecting the flames. Shadow planted himself in front of Ethan, low, rigid, his singed fur bristling. His growl was continuous and deep and unwavering. Hargrave's face was a mask of fury. The composed businessman was gone. What remained was a man who had lost control of everything. "You should have taken the money, Mercer. I gave you a way out. Nobody had to get hurt. The evidence is gone. The cabin is gone. And in 30 seconds, you will be gone too. Veteran dies in cabin fire during blizzard. The county will send flowers." He raised his pistol. Ethan stood still. 8 rounds, 4 targets. He could take 2, maybe 3 before the return fire ended it. He looked down at Shadow. The dog looked up at him. In 9 years, across 3 countries and 2 wars, they had never needed words. The dog knew this was the end of something. And he was not going to move from his position between his human and the guns. "You are wrong about one thing," Ethan said. His voice carried clearly over the fire and the wind. "The evidence is not gone. It is under the hearth. The fireplace is stone Hargrave. It does not burn. Whitfield designed it that way. He was smarter than you." Hargrave's face went white. "And you are wrong about something else. I am not alone. There is a man in Denver who has copies of everything. Lab reports, water samples, maps, tape recordings, including a recording in which Senator Ainsworth personally authorizes the injection system that has been poisoning this valley for 20 years. There is a deadline, 0600, 13 minutes from now. If my friend does not hear from me, the FBI gets everything." Hargrave's gun hand was shaking. Braddock stepped forward. "Warren, we need to leave, now." The 2 hired gunmen exchanged a look. Killing a man in a blizzard for a paycheck was one calculation. Killing a man 13 minutes before federal agents arrived was another calculation entirely. One lowered his rifle, then the other. Hargrave stood alone, his pistol still raised, his face a landscape of rage and ruin. Shadow growled. The sound filled the clearing. Deep, ancient, final. A sound that said, with absolute clarity, that if the trigger was pulled, 90 pounds of muscle and loyalty would cover the distance before a second shot could be fired. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Hargrave let out a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob. He threw his pistol into the snow and sank to his knees, hands behind his head. At 5:53 a.m., the sound of helicopter rotors began to penetrate the storm. 2 aircraft emerged from the low clouds. The first bore the insignia of the Montana State Police. The second was larger, darker, unmarked. Federal. "This is the FBI. Drop all weapons. Raise your hands. You are surrounded." Braddock dropped his pistol. The hired gunmen were already on their knees. Hargrave did not move from where he knelt. He stared into the burning ruins with the empty expression of a man watching his own funeral. Agents in tactical gear rappelled from the larger helicopter while state troopers secured the perimeter. The conspiracy that had held together for 15 years came apart in the time it takes to read a man his rights. Agent Thompson, a tall, composed man in an FBI jacket, approached Ethan as paramedics checked his burns and shadow-singed fur. "You must be Mr. Mercer. Your friend in Denver was very persuasive." It was 0600. That was the deadline. He called it 0600 on the dot. Told us a story so detailed, my supervisor had a helicopter in the air within 20 minutes. About the evidence. Mr. Hargrave seems to believe it was destroyed. Ethan looked at the ruins. The log walls had collapsed into glowing embers. The roof was gone. Everything was ash. But the stone chimney stood. It rose from the wreckage like a monument, blackened, heat cracked, but standing. The only structure fire could not destroy. Daniel Whitfield's final act of defiance. It is under the hearth. The cellar is stone-lined and sealed beneath a slate slab. The notebooks, the lab reports, the map, the tape recordings, and the wire I pulled off the trail the day I arrived. All safe. In the weeks that followed, the snow melted and the truth emerged. The FBI dismantled the ridgeline mining conspiracy with methodical thoroughness. The lab reports, the water samples, the engineering documents, and the tape recordings provided a foundation so solid that defense attorneys struggled to find a single crack. Sheriff Lyle Braddock was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning, still in his bathrobe. He was charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy, arson, and accessory to the disappearance of Daniel Whitfield. His Zippo lighter recovered from Ethan's pocket was entered as evidence, placing him at the scene of the assault. 12 county officials were indicted: building inspectors, land records clerks, water quality monitors, 2 members of the County Board of Supervisors. Each had played a role in the machinery of silence. Warren Hargrave faced federal charges that filled a document 47 pages long. Facing the possibility of spending his remaining years in prison, he cooperated. His testimony led prosecutors to Senator Richard Ainsworth, who was served with a sealed federal indictment at his office in the state capitol. The indictment detailed 15 years of corruption, including the direct personal authorization of a waste injection system that had contaminated the groundwater for an entire valley. Gerald Fenton, the man Whitfield had called Pike, was alive. The FBI found him in a small town in northern Idaho, population 800. He had been living under a false name for 15 years. He worked as a plumber. He lived alone in a rented trailer. He had no friends, no social media presence, no connection to his former life. When the agents knocked on his door, Fenton opened it, looked at their badges, and began to cry. Not from fear, from relief. 15 years of hiding. 15 years of sleeping with one eye open. Over, he testified before a federal grand jury for 3 days. His testimony, combined with Whitfield's evidence, created a case so airtight that Ainsworth's lawyers began negotiating a plea before the trial date was set. The EPA conducted a full assessment of the contamination. The results were worse than even Whitfield had documented. The injection system had been operating since 2005, 3 years before Whitfield arrived. The contamination plume followed almost exactly the red pins on Whitfield's map, affecting the drinking water of over 400 families. The connection to the childhood leukemia cases was formally established. Katie Burke, 7 years old, Jenny McAllister, Tyler Vance, and others whose names never made the news, but whose suffering was as real and as preventable as a valve being turned to the off position. A class action lawsuit was filed. The settlement was the largest environmental damages award in Montana history. Tom Prescott stood on the steps of his General store the morning the news broke nationally, watching the television crews set up their equipment on Main Street. His daughter Sarah drove in from Missoula that afternoon. She walked into the store, looked at her father, and neither of them said a word for a very long time. They did not need to. 15 years of enforced silence had finally ended, and the silence they shared now was a different kind entirely. The silence of people who had been proven right. Connor Walsh drove up the trail on a bright morning in early spring. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks. The meadows were soft with new grass. He stepped out of his rental car and walked to where Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing. The cabin was gone. Nothing remained but the stone chimney standing alone against the sky like a monument. Around its base, the first green shoots were pushing through the ash. "They are calling you a hero," Connor said. "I am not a hero. I just listened to my dog." Shadow, sitting at Ethan's feet, lifted his head and nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. "The evidence from the cellar was the key," Connor said. "It will put them all away. Hargrave, Braddock, Ainsworth, the entire chain. But more than that, the EPA is ordering a complete remediation of the valley's water system. Clean water, Ethan, for 400 families, for the first time in 20 years. Whitfield did that. We just finished his work." Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. The FBI had found it in an envelope taped to the inside of the metal box lid. It showed a man in his 30s, lean and sharp-eyed, standing in front of the cabin on a sunlit day. The cabin was intact, the chimney standing tall. The man had one arm around a golden Labrador retriever who was looking up at him with the uncomplicated adoration that only dogs are capable of giving. Daniel Whitfield and Copper, the journalist and his dog, taken in the summer of 2009, a few months before both of them were taken from this place. "He was not that different from us," Ethan said. "A man and his dog trying to do the right thing in a place where the right thing could get you killed." "So what is next?" Connor asked. "You could go anywhere. Write a book." Ethan looked around, at the mountains massive and silent, at the pines whispering in the spring breeze, at the clear cold creek running along the edge of his property, its water now on its way to being clean for the first time in 2 decades. He looked at the charred foundation, but he did not see a ruin. He saw a beginning. He saw a place where he had been tested and had not broken. A place where a dead man's truth had finally been heard. A place where a dog with a graying muzzle had refused to be silent when every human being in an entire county had chosen silence. He looked down at Shadow. The dog was watching him with that steady, knowing gaze. "I am staying. I am going to rebuild." And he did. The new cabin was built on the same foundation, using the old stone chimney as its centerpiece. The hearth remained. Ethan sealed the cellar beneath it, but left the original slate slab in place along with a small brass plaque mounted on the stone. It read simply, "In memory of Daniel Whitfield, who gave everything for the truth, and Copper, who stayed by his side." Shadow lived another 3 years. He spent them the way every good dog deserves to spend his final years, lying in patches of sunlight on the new porch, chasing squirrels with more enthusiasm than speed, eating scraps from Ethan's dinner plate when he thought no one was looking, though of course Ethan was always looking, and sleeping each night at the foot of the bed, his presence, a warm and constant weight that said everything words could never say. When Shadow passed on a quiet morning in the spring of 2027, he did so the way he had done everything in his life, without drama, without complaint, with his chin resting on Ethan's hand and his eyes open, looking at his person one last time before they closed. Ethan buried him at the edge of the clearing, overlooking the creek beneath a pine tree where the dog had loved to lie on summer afternoons and watch the world. The headstone was simple, a flat piece of Montana granite smoothed by hand, engraved with 4 words. Shadow, soldier, friend. He always knew. Sometimes the home we search for is not a place on a map. It is not a cabin in the mountains or a piece of land with a view of the sky. Sometimes home is simpler than that and more profound. Sometimes home is a bond, a silent, unbreakable connection between 2 beings who have walked through darkness together and emerged into the light on the other side. A bond that does not require words because it runs on something older and deeper than language. Ethan Mercer came to Montana looking for silence. He found danger, corruption, and a fight he never wanted. But in the middle of all of it, standing on a burning porch with nothing between him and death, except 90 pounds of gray fur and a pair of steady eyes that never once looked away, he found the thing he had been searching for his entire life. He found home. And home, he discovered, had 4 legs, a graying muzzle, and a heart that never, not once, not for a single heartbeat, considered leaving his side.